Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. Released in 1934, this murder mystery fiction is essentially a guessing game where the audience gets to take a seat in the detective's chair. There are several narratives that are combined in order to paint the perfect crime. Now, for those of you who are unaware for whatever reason, Agatha Christie is basically a legend. She was born in 1890 and she passed away in 1976, but not before publishing a multitude of novels and plays. She is one of the best-selling authors of all time. She's widely acknowledged in the literary world, and she is awarded and referenced often. A lot of times when I read books where, especially fiction books, where the main character is someone who wants to be a writer or someone who loves to read, I often see that Agatha Christie's name is dropped. So it's really funny, this is essentially your favorite author's favorite author. Now, Murder on the Orient Express is by no means new. It's almost 100 years old. But most recently, there was a film adaptation with a crazy talented cast that includes Johnny Depp, Leslie Odom Jr., Daisy Ridley, Kenneth Branagh, Judi Dench, Michelle Pfeiffer, Penelope Cruz, Josh Gad, Olivia Colman, and William Dafoe. How awesome does that sound? Now, as of yet, when this is being recorded, I have not actually watched the film, but I'm certainly going to. I wanted to go into this book, kind of with no expectations. Now, this book is structured into 3 parts. Part 1 is titled The Facts. Part 2, The Evidence, and this was a favorite of mine just because each chapter was titled The Evidence of, and then the character's name. So all of the secondary characters really got a chance to shine in this portion of the book, and it was nice how organized, it was, so you knew what to expect and whose story was coming. And part 3 was titled Hercule Poirot Sits Back and Thinks, and that's exactly what he does. Now, Christie, if I had to describe her writing in one word, it would be descriptive. That is because, for example, in the intro, we get a description of the size of the train, the usage of each train car, and the location of each train car. And I think that gets more relevant with time. As of now, people are not as familiar with riding the train as they may have been in the 30s. And so it's important to know that, there are different cars for sleeping and dining and things like that for this story and this plot line. And also through the dialogue of the characters. For example, one of the first interactions that Hercule has with Dubosc is him saying repeatedly, today is Sunday, tomorrow, Monday evening, you will be in Istanbul. And so it's like, that seems like an odd sentence to say, but it's really Christie revealing information through her characters. And there are times when the time of day is repeated or it's noted, and it's kind of unusual for a character in the story to look down at their watch and say, oh, it's 1:23. Usually authors will just stick with, oh, it's noon, or, it's late afternoon. And so that's one key detail that sets Christie apart, because her writing isn't awkward. Like, she's not just sticking in those details in random places. It seems natural. It's just we're not used to that type of writing nowadays. I'll get to that in the review. But the characters certainly were an extension of her writing abilities, obviously. Now, as far as literary devices, and I want to stop right here and just say, although this podcast is not the podcast that spoils things for you, by no means, the next couple of minutes may give you some, heads up. So if you want to completely be without spoilers, then skip ahead a few minutes. It's not going to ruin the story for you if you stay. But I know, it depends on my mood. Sometimes I want to go into something completely blind, and sometimes I want a little more information. But the next section may give you, a little too much information. Alrighty, so the first literary device I want to talk about is red herring, and that's probably the most important one. A red herring is a clue that is intending to be misleading or distracting. It's present in murder mysteries in order to heighten the confusion and ultimately stun the reader. And so this is something that's meant to completely throw you off. This is something, however, that is not present from Christie herself. She's not trying to mislead the readers. It's not her intention to throw out times or locations to throw us off the trail. However, and I make this distinction because it is important, in the plot, there is a red herring, but it comes from within that universe, from the character or characters themselves. So in the plot, there is a scarlet kimono that is the topic of discussion because it places someone at the crime scene, and it's literally red. This is a specific red herring that was an attempt from within the train car to mislead the passengers in order to cover up a crime. And so I find it interesting that although I don't believe Christie really used this device for us, the characters actually used it in the story themselves. So I just found that really funny. And also to comment on the fact that a lot of authors, I think, and playwrights or even people who write TV series will throw out red herrings in order to, I guess, keep the audience engaged. But if you do that enough, it gets boring. So one thing that comes to mind is Pretty Little Liars, if anyone has seen that show. In particular, there's a main villain who is A, and there are so many red herrings that I'm sure you can search up videos on the plot holes in Pretty Little Liars, because there's so many things that are thrown out there that at the time they make a lot of sense, but episodes later you find out it has nothing to do with anything. So that's just an example of what Christie is not and what makes her so great. And secondly, the most prominent behind, the red herring thing is foreshadowing. And I'm not going to spoil anything, so I think that you'll catch a lot of this on the second read, but also when you get towards the end of the book, you'll recognize that, certain details were foreshadowing the future, and then, as well as certain dialogue too. Now, when it comes to character, really only one matters, and that is Mr. Hercule Poirot. I don't know how to say his last name, so I'm just going to say Hercule. And that is because this is the person that is tasked with really solving this crime. This is also the person that has, I would say, the best capability to do so. That is because he has three main qualities. The first being perceptive. He's quoted as saying, "I look first at my witness, I sum up his or her character, and I frame my questions accordingly." Being a detective comes very natural for Hercule. And that quote, sums up his character very well. He has a tendency to be methodical when he is planning things, or even just his thinking. An example is in part 3, he took a whole half an hour to sit still with his eyes closed and think about the details. How many detectives do you know that do that? it shows someone who has patience and who knows that by clearing his head and blocking out all of the unnecessary noise, he'll be able to see a little bit better. I would liken this to meditation in a way, whereas you're not necessarily just sitting in silence. I think that's the common thing that people think meditation is. You're really just finding some level of peace so that you can figure, something out, or just, relaxing your peace. In this case, though, Hercule was intentionally blocking out the outside noise, whatever that may be, in order to find a solution. In addition, he has very measured questions. They're set to elicit meaningful responses. So being a detective and leading an interrogation, there's clear things that you want answered, and you're not always going to be able to get that answer from, that suspect. However, that doesn't mean that the interview is wasted. You can still receive valuable information, and that's one thing that Hercule does. He has targeted questions that don't answer outright what happened, but give us more detail so we can solve it later. And the best thing about his questioning is that the people he is interviewing or interrogating don't recognize that they are revealing information. Resilient is the next word to describe Hercule. He says, in reference to solving this crime, the impossible could not have happened. Therefore, the impossible must be possible in spite of appearances. So what he's really saying is, it may seem like this situation is impossible, but we have to really look through whatever it is, we may be seeing right in front of us, because clearly this happened. Clearly something's not right, and we need to get down to the bottom of this. And this is in contrast to the doctor and Mr. Bach, who are, I would say, on the quote-unquote jury with him. They're the three that are heading this investigation to solve, the murder of Mr. Ratchet. So the doctor and Mr. Bach let the frustrations fog their cognitive function, because it does seem like the situation makes no sense. But Hercule uses rational thinking throughout the book, despite it being a confusing, intentional mess. And so he's able to sit down and distinguish fact from emotion and apply those facts to the overall map of what may have happened. He's also not dismayed by character traits meant to intimidate him. There are more than a few times where he encounters people who obviously do not want to reveal, certain information to him, whether that be through standoffishness or maybe shyness or even just outright anger. And he's able to pull people from going on their personal tangents back to the topic at hand. He's able to cut through, the layered emotion and get the answers that he needs, or the details that he needs, more importantly. And lastly, he's observant. When we first meet him, he's watchful from the beginning, even before there was any hint of danger or, any hint of an investigation. He notices the mood changes around him. He notices when people get up and how their faces are, or the interactions that they're having with the people around them. One cool thing he does as well is he's able to reflect on, when strange things occur, what time it had taken place. And this is important because often when unexpected or bad things happen to us, the last thing we're thinking of is to look at our watch. But being that this is a crime and this is an investigation, obviously those things are important to know, when someone came, when someone went, who slept when, and things like that. So one instance when he is awoken out of his sleep, and it, seems to be nothing, and at this point there's no crime that he is aware of. He looks down at his watch and notes the time. And this is placed on the timeline towards the end. So obviously a piece of information that, had he been someone who is oblivious to the things around him, we wouldn't have that information. And we wouldn't know for a fact what was real and what was fake. And again, he catches the change in tone of a subject that he is observing. For example, Mary. He's able to clock when her anxiety turns to impatience. And that's, just through observing body language as well as interactions with people. And so all of this just really molds him into the perfect person to solve this murder. Now, when it comes to theme, the most obvious one is justice. So obviously we're trying to find who killed Mr. Ratchet. That's the main plot line, and Ratchet's murder is the catalyst of this story. That's what kicks everything off, and that's why we're kind of placed in this whirlwind of events here. But also, who deserves justice? So that's a question that's kind of lingering in the background. Obviously, we would all say the victim of crimes or whatever crime occurred deserves justice, but what if this one-time victim is a long-time criminal? Do we then extend empathy or mercy? But also, who decides what justice is? Hercules symbolizes natural law, I would say. He's a very, I would say, moral character. He is the general, the right over the wrong. In the end, though, Hercule, the doctor, and Mr. Bach ultimately determine the ending to this story and point determining how justice is served and what the justice is. My question to you all is, do you agree with their standing at the end of the book? And if so, do you consider that justice? This question is complicated once we unveil the motives behind the murder, as well as the background of Mr. Ratchet himself. Now, deceit is another pretty in-your-face theme. The culprit actively engages in tactics to conceal their identity, i.e. the red herring. But also this includes fake characteristics, fake backgrounds, and also just blatant lying. So that's something that is common throughout. And I won't say that you should go through this book actively believing everyone is lying, but just noting that everything may not be as it seems. But honestly, when you look a little further into things, you can see it from the beginning. And lastly, grief. So grief is almost a minor plot line here, but I want to put it into perspective that the amount of lives that trauma impacts is more than we really ever think about. So let's say for example, a terrible event may physically affect maybe 5 people, but those 5 people have others that care for them. And so it's the ripple effect. So certain events, murders, crimes, tragic endings, things like that affect a lot of people. And when you throw grief into the mix, it can consume one's ability to reason. And I think that's where we get into the dangerous zone here, because that grief, if someone doesn't have a healthy outlet, if they don't find that justice is served correctly or appropriately, they can go on to create another ripple effect of trauma. So that's something to just think about. And before we get to the review, I just want to touch on really quickly a motif that came up a little bit, throughout the narrative is nationality. So we have a diverse group of passengers here, and there is an emphasis on how different nationalities act. So how Americans act versus English versus Italians. So this can be shown through, the mannerisms, the motivations, the relationships, job status, things like that. But also language. There are a plethora of languages used between the cast. Now in the book, there are a few phrases or sentences in French, The rest of it is in English. I'm sure, however, though, you can get this translated into any language, but I would keep up Google Translate and just type in those, little phrases just so you can stay in the loop and be able to have all of that context available in order to, go further into the story. But it's mentioned a lot that in addition to French, there's English language being spoken, Italian, and German, and that adds layers onto our characters because it kind of spices up the motives a little bit. If people are speaking different languages, obviously that complicates the crime and who could have done what and all that good stuff. But also there are some vague attempts to scapegoat someone on the basis of nationality, and most of the time they're half-hearted remarks that really aren't based in anything. But that's just something that certainly came up a few times. And there were a few jokes about Americans and I don't know, whatever. It was kind of funny, but. All right. So my review of this book is, this is truly the blueprint of all murder mysteries. Previously, I read The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton, and that clearly took some cues from this book. Even the game Clue, if anyone has played it before, I looked it up. That was even invented after this book, and it's very similar. So, we can see where a lot of things in modern culture have come from. It's come from Agatha Christie. It was Agatha all along. See if you guys catch that. From a writing standpoint, it was excellent writing in my opinion. Not a word was wasted. Every detail in the end mattered, and it was another stroke of the bigger painting. So I don't feel like there was a lot of fluff, and sometimes writers will take pages and pages to drive a point home, whereas Christie didn't waste not one page. There wasn't not one paragraph that I felt we could do without. Everything had a purpose, and I think that upon reading it a second time, you'll recognize that. But there was no point where I found myself getting bored or that I wasn't paying enough attention to the details that I thought were minor. I was taking note of it as I was going on. I just didn't know where it fit into the picture. I will say though, I wasn't completely thrown off on the conclusion, but I was satisfied with the ending still. I didn't have a particular culprit in mind and was completely, sideswiped by the ending. However, I will say that Hercule, I wasn't on the same page with him throughout the book, and I feel kind of stupid, but I didn't catch everything until he actually said it out of his mouth. But he did a lot of observing. You could tell he really picked up on everything that happened. That's why he's the most important character in this book, not Ratchet. So in my opinion, this is a mandatory reread to see the beginning through a different lens. I feel like this is the type of book that it's so successful because reading it again and again and again doesn't take away from the suspense. Even if you know in the end, or you think you know what's happening, you can still enjoy the characters and their backgrounds and their narratives as well as the bigger plot line. And honestly, the only takeaway I have from this book is that karma's a bitch. And y'all better be careful out there. Don't go pissing nobody off, because the lengths that people will go to kind of ease their own grief, you don't want to be a part of that. So don't be out here just acting a fool. That's it. This was a fun read. It's certainly fun to read when the weather is really stormy like it is right now for me. It's been raining all day. It was a cool little, murder mystery thriller. It wasn't too scary where I felt like I couldn't read it in the middle of the night, but it was definitely entertaining, and we know why Agatha Christie is the legend that she is. because not, like I said, not one word was wasted, and I will stand by that. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. Not entirely sure on when I'm reading next week, but there will be an episode next week, so just tune in on Thursday and enjoy your weekend. And thank you so much.